Thank you, everybody. People in the back, if you feel like you can't hear me, just raise your hand throughout the talk and I'll just get louder. All right. Thank you, Genla, for this wonderful introduction. I'm still starstruck by Gen Sering Shakyala. His foremost book changed my life when I was young, growing up, looking for scholarship on Tibet. That was produced by Tibetans. So it's inspiring to be introduced by somebody I've admired for so long. And it's also through him that I learned about UBC as a school. This is my first time in Vancouver. It is beautiful here. Thank you for having me, and thank you for coming, even though the news was saying that there's going to be a flash flood or flash rain. So I'm really glad that you guys took out the time and to come out and hear me speak tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and present. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question. I mean, this talk is actually based off of an article that I recently published. So if you're curious, you can find this online. It's available open access, or you can go to Lakar Diaries. I also want to say I'm really excited to see Tibetan faces in the audience. So I just wanted to say tashle to everybody. All right, so I'm going to begin with a question. How does settler-colonial imperialism operate in Asia? And what are the ways in which Asian Indigeneities become mobilized? To address this question, in 2017, I brought together scholars who are observing various settler-colonial and imperial dynamics and developments across Asia for a panel titled Asian Settler-Colonialisms and Indigeneities at the annual meeting of the American Anthropological Association conference. At the time, scholarly considerations around Asian land and resource extraction had emphasized capitalism, development, governmentality, with scant consideration for settler-colonialism, despite the fact that the latter remains a vital framework for understanding the structural nature of imperial projects. Even the literature that adopted this frame drew its analysis primarily from Euro-American-centered examples, implicitly suggesting that settler colonialism is an innately Western phenomenon. Yet, capitalist developments with imperial consequences continue to impact Asia at varying scales. Such contemporary developments, alongside long Asian imperial histories, including those of China, Japan, and and India, complicate this assumption, even though you can say that about Russia too. This provokes questions such as, how does settler domination work when those involved in it are neither white nor from the West? How can we critically engage this while at the same time not orientalizing this history as a cultural peculiarity or delinking it from the deep influences of Western empire? With these questions in mind, I drew from recent innovative scholarship in anthropology, native studies, and ethnic studies to bring attention to the potential of interdisciplinary approaches for rethinking Asian settler colonialisms and indigeneities. For example, how might North American-centered settler colonialism literature complicate relationships between Asian nation states and their indigenous populations, especially when the latter, for a multitude of reasons, often do not identify as, nor are categorized as, indigenous? In my intervention on that panel, I focused on the question, are Tibetans indigenous? Since I made that article available to the public on the Tibetan platform Lakar Diaries in 2017, my intervention has influenced other scholars to ask similar questions, including in regards to the Uyghurs. Settler colonialism as a topic of interest was even raised at the 2024 Association of Asian Studies Conference. While these developments are encouraging, the central critique I raised in my 2017 article remains vital. As researchers, we should not concern ourselves with whether a group of people do or do not identify as indigenous. Instead, scholars must highlight the political stakes as well as the potentiality of why a group of people would or would not identify as indigenous. Doing so will allow researchers to highlight indigeneity as a political concept, constructed and contested between settler-colonial governmentalities and indigenous anti-colonial sovereignty movements. As I stated in my 2017 article, the stakes and potentiality of indigeneity as a political category are what concerns Tibetans. I highlight why Tibetans in exile rejected and later accepted identification with indigeneity due to the concept's changing political meaning. Such contestations over the political translation and meaning of indigeneity between settler states and First Nations anti-colonial land return movements highlight legal arguments over sovereignty. This is what my article stresses, that although indigeneity as a racial terminology was invented by settler-colonial imperial governmentalities in North America to take possession of First Nations territories and govern their bodies, indigenous sovereignty movements have redefined and decolonized such racialized renderings to highlight their political potentiality regarding regaining sovereignty. This contestation is what I argue highlights the politicized nature of translating indigeneity. Hopefully, this clarification will serve as a reminder to those presently considering indigeneity and settler colonialism as an analytic for certain dynamics in Asia to highlight the political stakes and potentialities of translating indigeneity. The terminology of indigeneity may serve as a signifier for the native, but its political mobilization between settler-colonial imperial governmentalities and indigenous anti-colonial sovereignty movements highlights how this contestation involves the right to define territorial sovereignty. With this interest in mind, I reintroduce this article for the broader audience. So, are Tibetans indigenous? It depends whom you ask. Although the governments of the People's Republic of China recognized the rights of indigenous peoples by voting in favor of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in 2007, it also claims there are no indigenous populations in China. Rather, Tibetans are categorized as Minzu, translated as ethnic nationality or minority, within the PRC. Tibetans have often been framed as indigenous by non-Tibetans, photographers, writers, or journalists in popular print media. But what about Tibetans? Do they identify as such? In Emily Ye's 2000 article, Tibetan Indigeneity, she engages with the question in the Tibetan context. She argues that the framing of Tibetans as indigenous has largely been imposed by Western and Chinese environmentalists due to Tibetan assertions of environmental stewardship and ecological wisdom. However, Tibetans in exile, according to Ye, have largely rejected identification with indigeneity due to the term's limitation, as they understood it as sovereignty without separate statehood or national inclusion in a multicultural nation. which limited the possibility of a future separation from China. For Tibetans living in the PRC, the limitation of indigeneity manifests as their classification as Minzu under the Chinese state. According to the PRC government, the Chinese population comprises 56 Minzu groups. These include both Han Chinese and Tibetans, which make it legally impossible for Tibetans in Tibet to identify as indigenous. However, Ye does not dismiss the possibility of change in the Tibetan stance on indigeneity, as she acknowledges shifts in the category. In this presentation, I will emphasize such shifts to propose indigeneity as an evolving terminology with translations that fluctuate through time and with political consequences, depending on who is doing the defining. I used Tibetan rejection of indigeneity in the late 1990s to illustrate this fact. This will involve an analysis of indigeneity as a legal and theoretical concept defined and contested between settler states and indigenous movements. If the term indigenous, native, Indian, or Indio emerged in tandem with settler colonialism in North America, they were a colonial construct. This is stressed by Aileen Morton Robinson, who argues that the category of Indian was invented by the settler government during colonial invasion of native territories. According to mainstream indigenous discourse, before colonial invasion, no one introduced themselves to one another as native. Rather, many identified and continue to identify based intersectionally on the names of their families, clans, tribes, and/or homelands. Similarly, before the Chinese invasion and annexation of Tibet, Tibetans identified themselves based on their family, clan names, hometowns, or regions. No one went around introducing themselves as native to each other. The word indigene is Portuguese and means native to the land. However, under settler invasion of indigenous lands, the category of the native or Indian assumed new meanings with legal and discursive consequences, argues Morton Robinson. Settler states framed indigenous peoples as backward and incapable of producing surplus value from their land, thus presenting them as primitive and or other in need of modern civilizing interventions. These reformulations are what, according to Morton Robinson, provided settler states with the legal and discursive basis for taking native territories. In other words, these reformulations of indigenous peoples as racialized backwards native or Indian subjects by settler invading states had no real implication for how tribes identified themselves and did not acknowledge their long-standing histories as sovereign territorial nations. Rather, the construction of this racial category in the colonies provided settler states with the legal justification for taking possession of native lands and bodies in the interest of European empires. Thus, early political concepts of indigeneity revolved around settler state definition, which were themselves informed by doctrinal debates within the Catholic Church. Such definitions sought to racially define and accord new meanings to indigenous peoples within settler state hierarchies that granted indigenous peoples rights to their own previously sovereign lands and lifeways. In Tibet, Tibetans were racialized as a backward other under the late Tsing Empire. However, after the revolution, the Republican government constructed Tibetans in the national imagination of China as primitive Chinese to justify the territorial incorporation of Tibet. Unlike imperial China, who did not identify with the Tibetans, the nationalist government identified Tibetans as Chinese, but as a backward group in need of modernizing interventions. This reinvention of Tibetans as primitive Chinese was later adopted by the communist government after it won the Civil War. Currently, racializing Tibetans under the Tibet autonomous settler territorial governance of the current communist government as a backward minority in need of Chinese modernizing, modern civilizing development provides the legal and discursive framework to justify Chinese settler elimination and or assimilation of Tibetan lands and bodies. As Ye stressed, it was the confusion surrounding rights versus sovereignty that Tibetan organizational heads in exile found perplexing. For them, the political movement for Tibet seeks sovereignty through self-determination frameworks, not settler-given rights. According to Kanawaki Mohawk anthropologist Audra Simpson, a rights-based politics seeks recognition from the settler-colonial state. Indigenous sovereignty refuses settler state recognition and instead is oriented towards indigenous systems of authority and recognition. In other words, sovereignty becomes the basis through which indigenous communities refuse the settler state. To understand why Tibetans from Ye's discussion refused the categorization of indigeneity, it is essential to consider how they understood the term. The Tibetan diaspora, including their government in exile, on which Ye chose to focus on, is based in India. Their understanding of indigeneity is thus partially influenced by how their host country defines the concept. To explain this, I turn to Sarah Schneiderman's 2009, her book Rituals of Ethnicity, in which she considers Thangmi performances of indigeneity in Darjeeling, India, in accordance with the Indian state's definition. In particular, Schneiderman explores the ways in which Thangmi leaders struggled to perform a version of Thangminess that would qualify them under India's category of other backwards classes, OBC, in the 1990s. India's OBC category is inherited from the British Raj and is reserved for groups that consider themselves native to the province. State recognition as OBC allows groups to access certain state-given rights reserved for groups that the state identifies as indigenous. For Thangmis to qualify as OBC, they must also accept being classified as backwards. Alongside performing traditional and ritual versions of themselves, Thangmis felt compelled to perform forms of backwardness that they thought would help their OBC qualification. For example, during their bid for OBC status with the Indian government, Thangmi leaders asked community members to begin consuming rats because an early ethnographic book on Thangmi stressed how rats were considered a staple in traditional Thangmi food. This was despite Thangmi ethnologists who debunked this assumption by pointing out that rats were consumed not because of tradition, but because of a particularly bad time when crops failed and starvation prevailed. Hold on, these pages are... Oh, some of these pages are doubles. Sorry, I just realized these are double pages. Where am I? So we're at Thangmis. All right. Alongside the OBC category, India also classifies specific groups under the scheduled tribe category. For instance, ethnic Tibetan groups living along the current border between Tibet and India are recognized officially by India as Bhotias. who in turn are categorized as scheduled tribe. On the one hand, the OBC category stresses indigeneity as backwards. On the other, scheduled tribe category recognizes groups as tribes rather than sovereign entities. For the Tibetan leadership in exile, both definitions were unacceptable. Alongside considering Indian definitions, Tibetans were also thinking about indigeneity as a legal terminology trafficked in the international arena. The United Nations declared 1994 the Year of Indigenous Peoples to recognize indigenous peoples' human rights. According to Carol McGranahan, this was the first time such a group such as indigenous people was internationally named and recognized. In accordance with UN action in the ensuing years, the Tibetan government in exile understood indigenous peoples as tribal rather than peoples with their own sovereign territories. At the time, McGranahan was told by Tibetan government officials not to use the term indigeneity when describing Tibetans due to this limitation. From this vantage point, it becomes clear why the Tibetan leadership in exile rejected the terminology in the 1990s. Accepting such definition meant acquiescing to a classification of themselves as inferior. It also degraded the Tibetan political goal of sovereignty. Rather than reject current understanding of indigeneity as defined by indigenous sovereignty movements rooted in claims of sovereignty and decolonization, Tibetans in exile were refusing indigeneity as defined by institutions such as the United Nations and modern settler states, which framed indigeneity as backwards and tribal, and rooted their politics in terms of rights rather than nationhood. This is what major indigenous sovereignty movements stress, that their activism is often misconstrued as seeking civil rights from the settler state rather than challenging settler state violations of national territorial treaties signed with the First Nations people during the inception of settler-colonial states. The Tibetan example demonstrates that the terminology indigeneity operates under different discursive frameworks depending on who is doing the defining, whether modern settler states and institutions or indigenous nations and movements. As such, indigenous groups rejection or acceptance of indigeneity as an identification depends largely on whether such definition exclude or include sovereignty. While the term indigeneity has been defined by settler-colonial states since its inception, indigenous movements have consistently challenged such definitions in both the discursive and legal arena. In so doing, they have decolonized the term to mobilize possible alliances and indigenous anti-colonial sovereignty movements that circumvent settler states and other capitalist institutions. Because the terminology was produced during settler-colonial invasion, it has become useful for indigenous scholars to challenge the attempts by settler states to hide them under neoliberal discourses that erase settler-colonial identity and histories. In the current era, Glenn Clouthart, so these are like famous professors here, just to let you guys know. Glenn Clouthart argues that articulations of settler colonialism have moved on from colonial domination to modern governmentality. In particular, he argues that the emergence of indigenous anti-colonial nationalism forces colonial power to modify itself from a structure that explicitly orients around the genocidal exclusion-assimilation double to one that is now reproduced through a seemingly more conciliatory set of discourses and institutional practices that emphasizes our recognition and accommodation. Regardless of this modification, the relationship between indigenous peoples and the state has remained colonial to its foundational. End quote. The result is that you have two opposing forces. On the one hand, there are settler states that seek to constantly change their systems while remaining steadfast in their original goal of eliminating indigeneity. On the other are indigenous activists and scholars who seek to challenge such structural changes through decolonial legal and discursive interventions. Because settler state institutions continue to use and define the terminology of indigeneity to serve their own goals, indigenous peoples have challenged such use with their own decolonized definitions through the interrogation of treaties signed between Native nations and settler states. This back and forth suggests that the terminology cannot be tossed out so easily. Rather, it has become a discursive site for legal contestations between common law settler states and indigenous nations. It is a high-stakes game that involves the right to define sovereignty, a concept that Michelle H. Raheja describes as, quote, as an open-ended process that involves critical and kinetic contemplations of what sovereignty means at different historical and paradigmic junctures. For Bonita Lawrence and Inakshi Dua, at the heart of indigenous peoples' realities, then, is nationhood. Their very survival depends on it. Indigeneity described from this vantage point is not about identification, but about sovereignty. Another reason indigenous movements and scholars have not completely thrown out the terminology is due to its salience in generating global solidarities between Native peoples and their anti-colonial stance against settler-colonial encroachments. Judging from this evolutionary trajectory, indigeneity has gone from being a colonial construct to a terminology operationalized by global indigenous movements to advance solidarities and sovereignty claims against settler nations and capitalist institutions in cahoots. In Analytics of Indigeneity, Miley Arvin's articulation of indigeneity refers to the historical and contemporary effects of colonial and anti-colonial demands and desires related to a certain land or territory and the various displacements of that place's original or long-term inhabitants. Arvin's concepts of indigeneity stresses colonial histories and territorial expulsion of native inhabitants. A framework Tibetan political movements in exile also stress through their insistence on Tibetan sovereignty. It could be argued that Tibetans can identify as indigenous. However, my purpose is not to insist whether Tibetans are in fact indigenous. Rather, recent trends among Tibetans in exile suggest that indigeneity, as defined by indigenous nations and movements against further encroachments on their territories by settler-colonial and imperial states and capitalist corporations, has become an important framework for considering the Tibetan political movement for sovereignty in the current moment. Tibetans living in North America, for example, have contemplated these possible solidarities by promoting indigenous movements such as the Idle No More movement in Canada and recently the No Dakota Access Pipeline campaign in communal spaces in the US and Canada. These movements also became avenues for Tibetans like me to reflect on indigeneity as a decolonial praxis that could prove useful for Tibetans in addressing settler colonialisms, sovereignties, refusals, and potential solidarities. While the Tibetan leadership in exile in the recent past has turned away from the settler state construct of indigeneity due to its limitations when it comes to sovereignty, non-organizationally based Tibetan individuals in North America are presently considering indigeneity as defined by indigenous movements. These inspiring movements have thus become the basis for Tibetans to address Tibet's recent history of communist China's settler-colonial occupation and ongoing histories of Tibetan nationhood. This suggests indigeneity as a political terminology has been experiencing shifting redefinitions, and because of such shifts, Tibetans have in the past rejected it while they consider accepting it in the present. So, can we assume Tibetans should in fact identify as indigenous? It depends on the politics of such redefinitions. My point, however, is not to argue whether Tibetans do or do not identify this way. A more interesting question is to ask where, when, and why Tibetans do or do not identify as such. As I have shown, indigeneity is not just about categorizing people symbolically, but also about leveraging international movements and creating strategic solidarities for native nations, mobilizing against the mechanics of settler governmentality. It is this political potentiality of indigeneity that civilian Tibetans are presently considering. Okay, that's the part I missed. This is my presentation, and quickly I wanted to show. So the above picture is of Tibetans. You see the I Don't Know More movement right there, and then the other two is at the North Dakota Access Pipeline. And below you have Pueblo youth of Santo Domingo tribe participating. They actually participated in a cultural exchange program with TCV, Tibetan Children's Village in India, Tibetan Refugee School, and you see the solidarity back and forth. So this is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dawa. Just for your information, the Muslim leadership here have traveled to Dharamsala and actually went to our different refugee settlements.
Oh, wow.
We were very closely connected with the Muslim leadership here, and they have always hosted the Solness' visit here. They hosted Kamapa's visit here also.
That's good to know.
The band council actually went to Dharamsala and went to all the Tibetan schools.
Oh, wow.
So we are sort of quite intimately connected, and it was very interesting. I forgot one of the Muslim leader who was the UN representative on the indigenous UN, I think, repertoire on the rights of indigenous, and when he was presenting his potential to the United Nations, the Chinese representative at UN asked him, do you think Tibetans are indigenous? And that's what the Muslim leadership told me. That they had a conversation with the Chinese leadership.
Interesting.
And they said, yes, they think Tibetans are indigenous, but they didn't obstruct him that time. So I just open the floor to any questions that you have to our speaker. Can you introduce yourself to that?
No, it's okay. Everybody will hear me. You know, as Canadians, we know quite a bit about residential schools. And unfortunately, Murray Sinclair, the person who gave 7 years of his life to holding a big inquiry into these evil institutions, which were designed to do the very thing you were talking about, impose the settler-colonial structures onto the so-called indigenous people. He just recently died a week or so ago, so we're still sort of mourning him. But any Canadian educator should shudder when they read in the Globe and Mail or hear somehow about these residential schools in Tibet. I mean, if ever there was a instrument designed to commit a genocide, yet in addition to an already existing genocide, we ought to be worried about that. And actually, as Canadians, because we know something about the evils of this kind of an institution, we ought to be working, as you said, in solidarity with those Tibetan groups to do what can be done to somehow stop this. But I'm sure that Searing will tell us, well, there's not much chance of that. I mean, when you read about the details, about how families are told, there's no choice here. Your child will be compelled to go to these schools and no, they will not learn their own languages and they will not learn about Tibetan history. We're going to turn them into little Chinese in order to conquer them with more certainty about the outcome. What's your view about this?
Well, there's definitely escalation in Tibet happening right now. This escalation started soon after the 2008 anti-colonial nationalist movement by Tibetans against the Chinese state's occupation of Tibet, inside Tibet. And, you know, the state retaliated by heavy securitization. A lot of people were imprisoned and disappeared. And then this was followed by the state's approach to this was Tibetans are too strong about their identity, so we need to wipe it out because it's becoming a source of resistance, which is true. So starting in 2009, they started to close down all the Tibetan-run Tibetan schools. These are the schools where Tibetans get to access their language, learn about their history. And in its place, kids are being forced now into boarding schools, and the required age, kids as young as 3 are being forced to go. And this is a way to accelerate accelerate assimilation and erase Tibetan identity. I describe this as a policy of elimination, which North America has already, like the First Nations here, has already experienced it. So we're right now, like at the edge of this right now. But is there hope in this situation? I think so. I read about the development of Tibetan schools in India, which was started by the Dalai Lama in 1960. And these schools have produced over 4 generations of students, the first generation being my parents. And it's in these institutions that Tibetan language is not only preserved, but is actively used. And then it's through these schools that you produce student subjects who produce our communities and our community members. So I think one way you can combat that is to actually support Tibetan communities, because it's in these communities that we are able to preserve our identity, language, and ways of being.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you introduce yourself? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I have 2 questions. How can scholars and activists balance the limitations and possibilities of indigeneity as a political category? And my second question is, what does the Tibetan case reveal about the intersections of indigeneity, sovereignty, and global power structures?
Wow, that was a lot of questions. How can young Tibetans, what was it again? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. How can scholars and activists balance the limitations and possibilities of indigeneity as a political category?
Mm-hmm. So that's why I wrote this article in the first place, because I just remember, I remember like white Tibetan studies scholars coming up to me and being like, hey, did you know that the Tibetan government is racist because they think indigenous people are backwards? And I was like, what are you talking about? And they were like, yeah, and like I read this article in the 1990s, the Tibetan government like rejected it. And I was like, you're not understanding what they're rejecting, right? So it is our responsibility to do the work, right? And this is why I wrote this article, to articulate how indigeneity as a terminology gets constructed by the settler state to racialize and control First Nations people, right? And then how it's actually indigenous scholars and movement makers who decolonizes the terminology, right, through their movement. And this became a way for me to intervene against these like ways of seeing indigeneity, but also to highlight how indigeneity itself has been transformed through indigenous movements that are inspiring people like us in North America, right? And that's why we have these like two different definitions happening. So this was my way of decolonizing these ways of seeing Tibetan rejection. It's like Tibetans are not rejecting indigeneity per se, but how it's being described in racializing ways, right? And that's what I wanted to highlight. So we as young scholars, we need to highlight how these translations are not capturing what's actually going on. And that's something that we can do, right, to combat that. So that's how I see myself addressing this. It's my way of decolonizing that way of seeing Tibetan rejection. If anything, I'm trying to highlight Tibetans are like, they're rejecting the same rejections of First Nations understanding of settler state definitions of indigeneity, right? They're emphasizing sovereignty. That's exactly what resonates with us, right? So that's how you intervene against these ignorant ways of seeing Tibetan rejections and refusals.
Hi, my name is Carlo Testa and I teach Italian politics. So on the strength of that, or on the weakness of that perhaps, I would like to ask you a low-level type of political question. Is there any chance that the government in India can be persuaded to create a status for the Tibetan nation who are refugees in India now for generations, a status that would not be flattening them against the backdrop of something that simply does not belong to them, that they do not belong to. They're not other backward castes. So let's see again.
Scheduled tribes and other backwards minorities.
That would recognize their distinct status as refugees from a distinct sovereign nation, and would not throw them into the same box as everybody else.
Thank you. So the categorizations, I was highlighting how there are different groups in India, specifically in Darjeeling, fighting to be recognized in order to have access to certain rights, right? And the recognition structure, you will have like two categories. You have OBC or you have scheduled tribe. And they themselves are limiting. But, they're trying to access their own rights through these avenues. So, and I tried to highlight how these structures have come about because India has in many ways adopted the British colonial structures. These actually terminologies come from the British governance of India. Tibetan refugees are categorized as refugees in India. But what's interesting about India is despite Tibetans being refugees, India has allowed Tibetans to have autonomy. The ability of the Tibetan government to be able to function in Dharamsala, the avenues for Tibetan schools to be separate Tibetan schools where Tibetan language can be preserved, Tibetan identity can be preserved. India has been extremely giving when it comes to the Tibetan refugee community. In many ways, Tibetans are able to kind of basically create Tibetan little societies, like places like Dharamsala. Like a lot of Indians will say when they come to Dharamsala, it feels like a Tibetan place, because it is. And that's because the Indian government allows that. So my example of India was to basically highlight how these other groups who are not recognized as such struggle. And then even within that struggle, they have to fight for marginalizing ways that these categories categorize them. Yeah.
Any questions? Yeah, back.
Hi, my name is Tsing. I'm a first year student at UBC. I have a question about like what is the ideal style of the Tibetan as Tibetan government territory look like? Should it be like a nation look like? Should like an independent country or just like a territory like maybe like side to the China or the EU or something? Like what's the picture roughly like considered as a Tibetan itself?
What is the Tibetan government's stance?
Yeah, I mean, I want to ask the question, like, what is the ideal result of the Tibetan, like, the perspective?
What is their political goal?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Right now, the Tibetan government is pushing for real, genuine autonomy. The Chinese government says that Tibet has autonomy, but based on what we're seeing inside Tibet, a lot of it is lip service, right? They're actually taking away a lot of Tibetan rights, including these boarding schools. Technically, under the autonomy structure, Tibetans have the right to self-determination, right? And what you're actually seeing with these policies, they're actually taking away and attacking these rights that the Constitution says they have. And not only genuine, like if you look at the map of Tibet, Tibet is only shown as central Tibet. The real Tibet is traditionally central Tibet and eastern Tibet, which includes Amdo and Kham, which has been sucked into Chinese provinces of Qinghai, Gansu, Yunnan, Sichuan. Right, and so the Tibetan government wants real autonomy for these three traditional territories of Tibet. And that's their stance, political stance. So it's sovereignty within the framework of real autonomy.
My name is Philip. I'm a third-year student at UBC. As someone who's spent quite a few years growing up in China and reading a lot of Chinese online discourse about similar topics, like whether it be Tibet or Xinjiang, a lot of their arguments from Chinese people would be that Tibet benefits from the economic growth of being part of China as a whole, and that there is actually quality of life increase for the population as well. So I was just wondering, are there Tibetans who agree with this stance, or how would you maybe counter arguments such as that?
I mean, that is a narrative that the state likes to also promote, right? And this is the same narrative that settler states in North America have promoted when they say, we're here in indigenous, they don't say they're here in indigenous territories. They say, we're here to civilize these people, these backwards people, right? It's the same rhetoric. They're not going to say we're here to take your territories and that's why we need this definition. They're like, we're here because we're civilizing these people, right? Hence the boarding schools. The boarding schools were supposed to kill the Indian, save the man, right? And again, this was supposed to be a civilizing mechanism. So these, discourses of civilization, basically implies that their presence is primarily to the betterment of these people. But they don't really say that they're taking their territory and governing them in a certain way that actually erases their ability to even speak their mother tongue, right? They're not going to say these things. So it's an old discourse, civilizing discourse.
Yes, Jen.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Robb. I'm the head of Asian Studies, and my question comes out of complete ignorance. And it's about the relationship between Tibetan Buddhism and the kind of political movements that you're talking about for sovereignty and so on. I know nothing about that. Is there a relationship?
Yes. I mean, the move for sovereignty is also about preservation of your way of life and the way you view the world, right? And then Tibetan spiritual practices is intimately tied with how Tibetans see and interact with the world and one another. And one of the things that Tibetans are known for is their compassion, which is heavily influenced by our spiritual ways of seeing the world and being in the world. So the move, the fight for sovereignty is actually also about preservations of these ways of seeing the world.
Any question? Yes, sorry.
It's about recent news articles that like in New Zealand, like the native people are rising, the indigenous people are rising. More indigenous terms are being used right now, like in this recent few weeks. And me, myself, being a Tibetan and growing up in exile, and partially in India as well. Since we were little, we weren't taught that we were indigenous. We were always taught that we were a Tibetan. And today, coming here, learning about what does indigeneity really means. And so what do you see, like, in terms of the Tibetans living in Tibet, like the Tibetan kids, and the Tibetans living in exile, like in different countries? And the term indigenous, where do you see this term going forward in the future? Because the new generation that's coming up, we don't really think about being indigenous nowadays, because everything is getting intersection. Like the intersection is just too much these days, you know. It's like everything, you know. There's no pure indigenous or pure indigeneity out here. So where do you see the indigenous or the indigeneity thing going forward in the future?
So part of the presentation I said indigenous just means native to the land, right? So when we say I'm Tibetan, we're claiming an identity about belonging to a land, right? That's our ancestral land. So indigeneity just means belonging and being from that land. It's a register for being native to that place. What I was trying to highlight is indigeneity has become a political mobilization, a site for political mobilization. And native nations like I Don't Know More and No Dakota Access Pipeline was about pipelines being drilled under sovereign lands. These are sovereign territories, you know, and these are violations of treaties. What you're seeing in New Zealand right now, the ripping up of the bill trying to reinterpret these treaties. These treaties were actually negotiated under duress, right? And it basically carved up their actual territory into smaller territories, and now they're coming after those territories. And that's what these movements are about. They're addressing not only past histories of taking, but you guys keep coming after our land, right? It's pointing those things out. And this is what I'm saying is resonating with young Tibetans in North America, right? Because they're addressing settler-colonial history and continued extraction, right? And that's what I'm trying to highlight. This is what's resonating with those who are like, oh, these movements actually talk about something that we're experiencing. And this is where this relation, like this identification is happening, right?
We will have time to scale Dawa, because for Yupi and myself, we are organizing future events, and we're hoping to have an exhibition at the Museum of Anthropology in the near future, and we have a very exciting sort of project where we're asking our Tibetan children, school children in Vancouver, to do the picking of the objects to display. We're not the professional curators going to pick them, and we show them to the children. They pick up, and they are going our Saturday Tibetan language school. They have to write an essay on why they picked that object in Tibetan, and then we could translate that into English and Tibetan. And Fuyubi is leading the exhibition and been coming to our language school. They're doing that. And so we already had the plan to bring Dawa to as one of the speakers, and we have an exciting Tsing Lama, who's another great novelist, who's coming, and we will do that. And so you will have a chance to hear Dawa another time in very near soon. And I'd like to thank Dawa for really very short notice and asking her to do this talk for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bella. Thank you.